I think that the degradation of postal service is likely to continue under Trump. Of course, I think that if people raise enough of a stink, that can be stopped.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Joel Bleifuss is editor of Barn Raiser, which is a new outlet that publishes independent news, analysis, and information to support diverse, civically engaged, and dynamically connected rural and small town communities. They champion the free exchange of public dialogue by bringing together underrepresented voices and perspectives on the intractable issues facing communities and policymakers, and seek to convene a space where big ideas and bold questions enliven local connections, where daring criticism, rational debate, and compassionate care will renew the social imagination to build common ground, encourage democratic participation, and inspire change. Joel Bleifuss was also at In These Times magazine for 30 years before leaving to found Barn Raiser. Joel, welcome to the Valley Labor Report. Thank you for taking the time.
Glad to be here.
Really glad to have you. So we gave a little bit of a what Barn Raiser says about itself. We'll talk about Barn Raiser later in the program. We wanted to talk to you about the election. And so I guess the first question on the election is, why do you think that it went the way that it did?
Well, I think the economy is the number one reason. You look at all the exit polls, and people who voted for Trump, they cited the economy and immigration as their two top issues. I think the Democratic Party is also somewhat to blame for running the kind of campaign it did. And I would add that the maybe the sort of the political class in this country is doesn't know how to campaign in rural areas or to reach working people. And I think that sort of the combination of a Democratic campaign with a bad message and then a bad campaign sort of together were sort of enough to guarantee that Trump victory.
Right. I think that's kind of... Go ahead.
The exit polls are pretty clear on all this. And I think you look at the union movement in Wisconsin, 50%, more than 50% of union members voted for Trump.
Is that really the case?
It's like 51%, yeah, according to the exit polls. And union members made up 20% of the electorate in Wisconsin.
Wow.
And so I think this also is sort of a message for organized labor, and especially sort of a Washington-centric labor approach. And so I think that both the Democratic Party and sort of labor leadership have to take a long, hard look at this campaign and where the money that they poured into it went.
Yeah, I think that's true. That the economic, the economy being the reason for the election, I think that is really emerging as kind of the answer that most people are landing on. And it does seem like, this is affecting incumbent parties and politicians across the world, really. With one notable exception being Mexico, where the Socialist Party there, Morena, actually increased its vote share after winning in 2018, which is interesting. And I think that the analysis that I think a lot of people would have about that is that, Mexico really is undergoing something akin to a New Deal style reformation of the economy in favor of working people, to the benefit of working people, whereas regardless of official political affiliation, whether they're liberal, conservative, centrist, whatever, other governments in the Western world are nibbling at the edges, kind of at best. That is interesting about Wisconsin. My understanding is that nationwide, union members were the only demographic, basically, to not move towards Donald Trump. So I wonder what the union vote in Wisconsin was in 2020.
I think that's understandable, that and it shows. I wasn't sort of blaming labor at all for the loss, but I think
Right.
it just shows the amount of work that has to be done in the labor movement itself to increase the vote of
Hmm.
its members. That maybe includes a different kind of look at political education, perhaps instead of spending lots of money on TV ads, investing more in creating labor community coalitions in states and communities, things like that. So I think the strategies can be re-examined, maybe.
Right, and something that we've been, off and on over the years, consistently kind of ringing the bell about it is, the importance of building up independent worker and labor focused media. I mean, the right has this whole propagandistic ecosystem, right? And there's just not really the same kind of thing on the left. I mean, there are similar types of things for Democrats, with MSNBC and to a certain extent CNN, but there's not like a left-wing labor type of equivalent to what they have on the real radical right. And for just, I always, every time I see the PAC expenditures from labor, I like a tear goes down my face because I'm like, if you gave like the labor radio stations, if you gave outlets like yours like a fraction of the money that you spent developing these TV ads and sending them out, imagine what could be done and what could be done in a sustainable, like ongoing way, right?
I think when looking at the TV ads, I think that there's also something that most people don't realize. I mean, of the hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that the Harris-Walz campaign spent on television ads, 15% of that money that's paid to the TV stations for those ads goes to the consultants as their fees on average. And so there's this political group of political consultants tightly connected to the Washington Democratic establishment that every election year makes millions of dollars running television ads rather than, say, investing in community groups or long-term organizing, things like that. And I think that the Democratic Party has to totally rethink how it spends its money in elections and that it invests for the long term rather than the short.
Right. And so now that Trump has been elected, he will be inaugurated in January, and we'll have a second Trump administration. What are some of the top line items that you are anticipating as as what this is going to mean for particularly workers and unions in rural America and in the South? But any broader than that, that you're interested in talking about, but particularly for those communities.
Well, I think on day one he'll replace the NLRB, and if not replace it, incapacitate it. So that's going to happen immediately, I think. And with the NLRB, without its support, who knows what's going to happen to labor law and what can happen. There won't be any recourse. So I think that's a major concern. We look at Bezos made friendly with Trump by not endorsing him in the Washington Post before the election. I think what does this do for the sort of Amazon workers to have a president who's beholden to Bezos and Amazon? The post office is the big issue too, especially for rural folks. Is it going to continue sort of as it was going in the last Trump administration, where there was all this attempts to turn over postal office functions to private companies? And then industrial policy. I think that it's really understandable looking in the Rust Belt in the Midwest why many union members are skeptical of Democrats. If you look what happened in the 90s with NAFTA and the sort of destruction of industrial infrastructure in this country, whole communities were sort of impoverished, and there's a lingering effect of that that you see everywhere along what's called the Rust Belt, but post-industrial the United States, and I would gather in similarly in areas of Alabama.
So you had a few different things, and I want to talk about the post office and the industrial policy part for a second. And let's start with the post office because our online, I mean, our main audience is the radio. I don't think that the people who listen to us online kind of recognize that. We're on 4 radio stations. There are tens of thousands of people that hear us on the radio across 3 states and in 4 cities. But online, our audience has pretty significantly increased because of our coverage of the letter carrier's tentative agreement with the Postal Service, and so we've been covering that, and some of the people who have just started listening to our program have been surprised by the fact that we're not Trump supporters. For some reason, I don't know why, but they have said things like that. They think that Trump is actually going to be good for the post office. And so you mentioned you just mentioned that the post office is going to be something that you're going to be looking at in the Trump administration. But I know that you are not anticipating good things from a Trump administration. What kind of things are you anticipating that a Trump administration might do to the post office?
Well, I think closing rural post offices, which are quote unquote economically inefficient. Many people in rural America rely on a small post office that's maybe open 4 hours a day. And it's a community center where people meet, where people get their medicines because they're not close to a pharmacy, where people depend on, it's one of their connections to the outside world. And with those closed, people are isolated. And that was, I know that Bernie Sanders has been very active in trying to preserve rural post offices. And I think that the degradation of postal service is likely to continue under Trump. Of course, I think that if people raise enough of a stink, that can be stopped.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
The one of the things that at least one person did not believe me about, as far as my kind of predictions about the Trump administration, was that I anticipated that there would my basic, what I had said was that I think that the best really that folks can hope for vis-a-vis the Postal Service from a Trump administration is that he just ignores it, that he has other things on his mind and he doesn't really care about the post office, and that it is ignored for 4 years. That's kind of, that is kind of honestly my hope for the post office during a Trump administration. And I said that if attention is put on it by the Trump administration, that there would likely be privatization. And they didn't believe me, despite the fact that the Trump administration in the past, in 2018, actually put out a plan to privatize the post office. Like, this is something they have publicly said they want to do. But can you just explain, like, why privatization is something to be concerned about? Why shouldn't we want the post office to be privatized?
Well, I think that, the number one issue, one of the main reasons was that the post office is a universal service now. It's required to deliver letters anywhere in the United States that somebody lives, if they're to the post office in their neighborhood, at least. If it's privatized, you would have the companies that would run the delivery service of letters or packages could decide, well, this area is not economical to serve. And therefore, if you want to get a package or a letter in, rural Nebraska, for example, you have to pay more than if you were sending something to somebody in the suburb you live in. And so I think it's a standardization of policy, similar to insurance. I mean, the way that insurance works and Obamacare is that, everybody's in the same pool, and people who need more care, their care is supported by those who need less. But everybody benefits by bearing the burden for others. Similarly, like most public services, that's what's going on with the post office. The 100 people who use a rural post office in the Dakotas in a small town, that post office is, maybe quote unquote not economically efficient, but it's part of being a society that we provide that service to our members. Right. And so it's like a glue that holds people together, and that should be valued.
I agree. And that's the role of government. And that's why, I think in my view, some of the idea about, the Postal Service is losing money, and that's why the letter carriers need to kind of take it on the chin with this contract is kind of, wrong-headed. I think that the argument should be that to the extent that the Postal Service does run in the red, which it does not that much, it should just be backfilled by taxes, because it's important. It's an important institution, and also the for the workers, privatization. I mean, we just talked about literally last week how there's a group of 400 workers at the University of Central Florida, I think it is, that had a union before, and their union was decertified by SB 256, by this new anti-union law in Florida. Their collective bargaining agreement was nullified. And so as a result of the nullification of their collective bargaining agreement, UCF privatized all of these 400 jobs. They're now going to be working for a new private company. Supposedly, they'll be keeping the same wages. We'll see how long that lasts. But for existing people, their pensions are frozen. No more contributions, and they're not going to be getting anything more than what they have earned to this point, and new employees won't get a pension. That in and of itself is huge. That is 400 people have essentially lost their pension. I mean, it's just an enormous, and that's the kind of thing that you get with privatization. So let's talk about industrial policy.
And on the
go
other
ahead.
side, you have the owners of that company that are now doing what used to be a government function, and they're raking in millions. And so it's a great example of the Republican governor and his friends enriching themselves and their friends.
Exactly. Let's talk about industrial policy then. You mentioned that industrial policy has been like one of the reasons that rural communities have shifted from the Democratic Party because of like NAFTA and things like this. And the all of our structural critiques of the American economy notwithstanding, there has been some movement from the Democratic Party and from the Biden administration on industrial policy. And we are actually seeing a manufacturing boom at this point. It's coming down the pike. There are more manufacturing jobs than there were under the Trump administration. There's more manufacturing construction going on. And a lot of that is happening in, to a certain extent, rural and many red states. And so why do you think that the creation of these jobs, and a lot of them, many of them being union jobs? I mean, I got a call from a building trade union leader. We are in Huntsville near a federal enclave, Redstone Arsenal, where, there's lots of construction happening. And I got a call from a building trade leader in the area saying, there were like tens and tens of millions of dollars in construction that was coming down the pike that under the current executive order would be union construction. And he was like, it's all gone. It's all gone. And now it's going to be worked by non-union building trades folks who are going to be getting paid lower wages. They probably won't have health care. They probably won't have a pension. And probably a lot of them will be from out of town. Right. Mm-hmm. And so why do you think that? Do you just think that the industrial policy, to the extent that it has improved, has just not improved enough? Is that kind of what your assessment of that would be?
Well, no, I think that was one of the untold stories in the campaign, is how how much better things have been in many parts of the country because of the huge infrastructure investments that have been made by the Biden administration. And it's unfortunate that the campaign didn't run on those or didn't forefront those in a way that it could have. And I think that, again, this gets back to, well, what story are we telling the American people about life in the United States? And I think it was a tactical mistake to put all the talk in the campaign toward the end on abortion and on democracy. If you look at the exit polls, and 70% of Americans pretty much across the board support a woman's right to reproductive health. But that didn't change their votes because a significant group of the people who believed that voted for Trump. One should have run on an economic argument and talked about Trump's economic policies and what Biden and the Democrats have done for the economy in the past 4 years.
So, Joel, you mean that you don't think that parading around with Liz Cheney was able to activate a huge portion of the electorate, the Liz Cheney base? You don't think that was there?
Not for people who had memories, perhaps.
That really is. That's just such a befuddling thing to spend hours with Liz Cheney. Like, the person, I don't think, if I'm remembering this, and you can correct me if this is wrong, I don't think it is. I don't think that there was an incumbent that has ever lost a primary election as bad as Liz Cheney did. Like, there's not a base for this. Nobody cares.
In her home state. Right. I mean,
yes, in her home state. Yeah. In her district, in her home district, like 100,000 people. Yeah. I mean, it's crazy. It's bizarre. I don't understand. I don't know. The whole time I was thinking this, and I was like, but I don't know. These people, like you said, these consultants getting paid millions of dollars, seeing all these internal polls, they must have must have access to information that I don't, because I'm just a dummy. I don't make millions of dollars to consult presidential campaigns. Maybe they know something that I don't, and they didn't. I don't know. It's frustrating.
And you also look at the responsibility of her father in the Afghan war and how unpopular that was, and how Trump has been running on that he ran on that as one of his issues, is this foreign intervention. And right. It made no sense. I mean, it was a strategic ploy to try to supposedly win over suburban women voters, but it didn't work.
So, with all of this, with this coming down the pike, the NLRB, potentially some really bad ramifications for the post office, particularly for rural communities, and potentially, a rolling back of some of this positive. Again, we've got structural critiques of the economy that we can talk about, and we can talk about all day. But I was talking to Adam this morning. As far as American economies go, in the last 40 years, this is about as good as it's been. Mm-hmm. And some of this industrial policy is part of the reason for that, and we could be looking at rolling some of this back. I mean, the Johnson guy, the leader, the Speaker of the House, and potentially continuing to be Speaker of the House, depending on how the House races wind up. He was talking about rolling back the CHIPS Act, the Chips and Science Act. We could see some of that kind of. A lot of the Inflation Reduction Act money has not been spent yet. So I mean, there's a real concern here about rolling back some of this stuff. The FTC, the CNBC, they were talking about how the big winners here are companies that want to do mergers and acquisitions. We're going to lose Lena Khan at the FTC, and a lot of it's a lot of bad stuff coming down the pike. And so how do you think in the next 2 months that we have before Trump takes office, what should unions be doing in these 2 months?
I think that everybody who was involved in this election should, take a serious look at what happened and why it happened. And it doesn't have to be sort of a finger pointing exercise, but I think it needs some deep soul searching on the part of how all the resources and manpower, woman power that went into this election, how they were deployed and to what ends. I think that there needs to be a rethinking of political engagement. You look at that it's a very proven fact that this technique known as deep canvassing can, change people's opinions about politics and change their votes. But that takes time, and that takes on the ground investments, which unions have done a lot with, but it also takes having people in a community talking to their neighbors in the community about the issues. So I think that there needs to be a sort of profound look at how the Democratic Party campaigns and what its message is to the people it's trying to reach. We're running a series on interviews with rural political strategists on what they think of the campaigns, and it's been pretty eye-opening to me to just listen to the despair from them on how they're not listened to in Washington, and how the party sort of ignores their advice on how to reach rural people, for example. And it's, one woman who's been doing this for decades, she sort of blamed what she called the pronoun progressives for pushing forefronting a agenda that is sort of alienating to some segments of the population. So I think there needs to be a re-examination of how we relate to people, especially working people and rural people who, may be somewhat different from an urban progressive audience.
Are there any lessons from history that you feel like are relevant to this political environment?
I think, the New Deal is one. The revolt of the populists in the 1880s and 1890s, who stood up to the Gilded Age barons who controlled the railroads, and working people in this country have risen up. But to get to your point that you made at the beginning, you can't blame people. I don't think. I think people vote on the information they're given, and how they understand the world. And as you said at the beginning, there isn't, labor issues. They're not given the type of coverage they should, or the support they should in the media. That's why I left in these times and started Barn Raiser, because I'm from a small town in Missouri, and I just felt that the rural people in this country were not being well served by a media establishment that looked down on them, that sort of ignored them, that said, well, they're hopelessly sort of retrograde reactionaries. And that's not true. There's a very vibrant political culture in rural areas. It's just a minority culture, because it's, the rural counties are by and large red in this country. But that doesn't mean they have to be that way, and that doesn't mean that it isn't worth trying to change that and organizing there.
Right. Well, it's worth knowing that a lot of populist, socialist, red, left-wing type of movements have, either originated from rural and, some, they've taken off in some southern communities, but particularly in rural communities. Eugene Debs, one of America's most famous socialists historically, comes from rural Indiana, right? And the Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Party actually comes out of an alliance that the of the Farmer Labor Party, right? You know, so the idea that all of this is circumscribed and that that rural people are kind of inherently backwards or all this kind of stuff, I think that we know is silly, and so it's an exciting.
Go back, say, to the 70s and the sort of farm revolts against Carter and Nixon. This whole Earl Butz, the Secretary of Agriculture, the idea that you get big or get out. That the industrialization of agriculture in this country put a huge number of family farmers out of business, which then hurt the communities. And you combine that with the Walmartization of the rural economy, where all the downtowns sort of became boarded up because a Walmart came in, and you've lost your community structure. And you have combine that with NAFTA in the 90s. It's just one cumulative loss of economic power in rural and small town communities.
Right. All right. Joel Bleifuss, editor at Barn Raiser. You can check it out. Is it barnraiser.com or .org?
It's barnraisingmedia.com.
Barnraisingmedia.com. Is there anything else that you'd like to leave our listeners with before we let you go?
Well, I really think it's great that, the show you're producing here, because there needs to be more of that across the country. So thank you for allowing me to be part of it.
Appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time. Thanks for doing what you're doing. And let's keep in touch.
Take care.
All right. You too. All right, folks. Again, that was Joel Bleifuss, editor of Barn Raiser, a newsletter and news organization about rural communities. You can check it out at barnraisingmedia.com. You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.